Today, I have the immense privilege of welcoming Emily Dufton to Politics and Prose to discuss her book, Grassroots, The Rise and Fall of Marijuana in America, which tells the story of marijuana's path from acceptance to demonization and back again. From the frenzied anti-marijuana propaganda of the 30s to the protests of the 60s to the Just Say No campaign of the 80s to the present-day medical research, Elizabeth Hinton says of Grassroots, quote, no matter which side of the marijuana debate you're on, Grassroots will make you reflect on the meaning of democratic values and the role of government in our lives, a critical read. Emily Dufton received her PhD in American Studies from George Washington University and has contributed to a variety of outlets such as the History Channel, NPR, The Atlantic, and the Washington Post. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Emily Dufton.
Wow, well, thank you so much for having me here. Honestly, it's always been a dream of mine to speak at Politics and Prose. I just had to spend 7 years researching and writing a book first, it turns out. So I'm here, and I am so very grateful for this opportunity. So thank you so much for coming out. I really appreciate it. We're also here 2 days before the first anniversary of the Trump inauguration. Whatever your feelings on the subject, I think we can all agree that it is an immensely weird time to be alive, right? And perhaps no more so than in America's shifting relationship with both legal and illegal drugs. Last year, around the same time, I read somewhere, probably Twitter, that if Hillary Clinton were marijuana, we would have experienced a very different inauguration last January 20th. And this is not to say that if Hillary Clinton were made of weed, we would have had like President Pot or whatever. But rather that in the 4 states that voted to legalize cannabis the same day we elected Trump, marijuana got considerably more overall support than either presidential candidate. And this support both was and is overwhelmingly bipartisan. And this, as a nation, we can't seem to agree on anything right now, right? Not on DACA, Me Too, funding the government, North Korea, Russia, if countries should or should not be called shitholes. But a recent Gallup poll suggested that 64% of Americans currently support legalization. We hate each other, but it's fine if you smoke. Until it isn't, right? After voting to legalize marijuana in November of 2016, California dispensaries opened their doors for legalized sales on January 1st of this year. California is a big deal in the world of legalized cannabis. Recreational sales in total gathered about $10 billion in 2017 before California hit the market. By 2020, California is expected to account for $5 billion in sales alone. So as the nation's most populous state and also as the first to legalize medical marijuana in 1996, California has the longest history of putting the drug into the public sphere. People have always bought pot in California. Now they have for 2 decades. Now it's just that much easier. But 3 days after California's law went into effect, Attorney General Jeff Sessions revoked the Obama administration's Cole memo, which basically said that within reason, federal officials would let state legalization laws stand. Sessions' action didn't actually do that much. It's more saber-rattling than anything else. Since 95% of drug arrests occur at the state level, and a federal crackdown on large-scale growers or distributors would require a system of people and funds that neither the DOJ nor the DEA seems to have readily at hand. But still, it's a very clear symbolic shift, right? Your rising social acceptance can go straight to hell, is what Jeff Sessions seems to be saying. It's my Department of Justice. I think pot is as bad as heroin, and I'm going to do what I want. When news about Sessions' action went live, people lost their minds. Legal pot is already a chaotic industry. Anything that remains legal on the state level but illegal on the federal level obviously faces an uphill climb. But Sessions' announcement jump-started fears of a return to the war of drugs of the 1980s, with more busts, more arrests, more overt targeting of African Americans. People saw in it overtly racist motives and feared we hadn't actually learned from past mistakes. My old college roommate immediately messaged me and asked me how much of Sessions' action is based in his well-known bigotry. But as for me, I wasn't surprised by what happened at all. My book was released 1 day shy of 1 month exactly before Sessions' action was released. And in it, I think I used to know the page number, I predicted that Sessions would revoke the Cole memo. I did not think it would happen that quickly, but it did. And I believe that his reasons for doing so are far more complex than mere racism, particularly since recreational legalization has overwhelmingly benefited the white middle upper class, because those are the people who can afford legal pots, high fees, and even higher taxation rates, and for the most part, legalization has occurred in states with overwhelmingly white majority residents. Instead, I believe that Sessions' actions and people's impassioned response to what he said are products of a 50-year battle over legalization that has brought us to this point, as well as a distinct resurrection of previous behaviors. The cycle of marijuana's acceptance and disavowal, the pendulum's constant swing between legalization and criminality, these things shift to match each historical circumstance, but in their retelling, the pattern remains fundamentally the same. So that's what my book and my talk tonight are both focusing on. The emergence of this pattern, what has happened since the first legalization protest of 1964 to bring us to what we're arguing about now. And perhaps you'll see for yourself the same pattern that I think is there, or you won't, but either way, we'll be able to discuss it in the question and answer session afterwards. So, as I said, the first legalization protest took place in 1964. In August of 1964, in San Francisco, to be more precise. There is a lot of marijuana history prior to 1964, but I only have half an hour. So I'm not going to focus on that, but I can give you a bibliography of some really excellent books if you're interested. Instead, I start in 1964 when a 28-year-old young man named Lowell Eggemeyer walks into the San Francisco Hall of Justice, lights up a joint, declares that he is starting a campaign to legalize marijuana smoking, and asks to be arrested, which he is, immediately. Eggemeyer's action is the first shot in what would become a 50-year battle over marijuana, in which thousands of average, ordinary American citizens were inspired to go to war over pot. Whether they supported or opposed this drug, together, these two factions of grassroots activists changed the nation's marijuana laws 3 times. First, they spread decriminalization to a dozen states in the 1970s. Then a counter-revolution recriminalized and essentially demonized the drug in the Just Say No 1980s. And then a revitalized legalization movement worked for growing social acceptance of medical marijuana in the 1990s, which paved the way for growing acceptance of recreational marijuana today. And it hasn't stopped, right? In turn, today's growing social acceptance of recreational has launched yet another counter-revolution, which we see in the actions of people like Jeff Sessions, in the work of prominent anti-legalization activists like Kevin Sabet, and in how major pharmaceutical manufacturers are spending oodles of money to lobby lawmakers to vote against legalization, since it cuts into their bottom lines. States that have legalized recreational or medical marijuana have considerably fewer prescriptions written for opioid-based painkillers every year. And it all starts with a guy named Lowell Eggemeyer, which is just fun to say. So anyway, I'll give the very abbreviated version of marijuana activism's history. So like I said, Eggemeyer, 28 years old, 1964, walks into the Hall of Justice, and he basically launches a revolution, much to his own surprise. I talked to him. He's not a hippie. We associate pot with the hippies in the 1960s, but by 1964, hippies are not a fully formed idea. We're 3 years away from the summer of love. Eggemeyer wears t-shirts and jeans. His hair is cut short. He likes to spend time with his dogs. He is not the person you think of to launch a marijuana revolution, because it's not so much him as it is his attorney, James White. White was a libertarian, quote, to the right of Barry Goldwater. That's how he would describe himself. And to defend his client, which he represented pro bono, he digs up these old government reports where the federal government discusses marijuana. And they're really quite old. the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission of 1894, and the Panama Canal Zone Commission of 1925 were two of them. And he shows in these reports that the government argues that marijuana is both less toxic and less habit-forming than two legal drugs, tobacco and alcohol. And by showing that the federal government once felt this way, White argues that modern laws against marijuana are unconstitutional, and so his client does not deserve to be jailed for marijuana's use. The California court does not believe him. Eggemeyer remains in jail. After Eggemeyer is released, he actually abandons the movement, so the first activist bails out. But White stays with it. He becomes very inspired by this movement because as a libertarian, he believes that the government should not control what we do, especially in the privacy of our own homes. He releases the reports to the general public on mimeographed pamphlets called Marijuana Puffin with like hand-drawn leaves on them. They're quite comical. And he starts a new organization called LEMAR, which is a contraction of legalized marijuana, which quickly spreads throughout the San Francisco area. And Allen Ginsberg happens to be in San Francisco at the time as well, the well-known poet, Howl, et cetera, et cetera. He attends one of the first LEMAR rallies in December of '64, and when he returns to New York, he brings the movement with him, and really establishes a base in the Peace Eye bookstore in the East Village. With the support of Ginsberg, LEMAR goes national, and really quite rapidly. But calls for legalization get wrapped up into something else, and this is what transforms it into a far more powerful movement. It joins with the burgeoning youth movement of the time. Finding these old reports, which the federal government has backpedaled on since their release, a growing number of young people see a familiar story. The government has lied to them about winning the war in Vietnam. The government has been lying to them about the necessity of segregation. And now they realize that the government is also lying about the danger of marijuana. Combined with the growing baby boomer-fueled counterculture and marijuana's obvious rising rates of use, cries for legalization get swept up in the same movement that launches enormous anti-war marches and civil rights demonstrations. It is a moment of extreme historical kismet. Richard Nixon, who was first elected president in '68, recognizes let's say the threat that the youth movement poses to his administration. So he and his Attorney General, John Mitchell, lobby to pass the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, which you may recognize from the 5 schedules that it places all drugs into. Schedule 1 is considered, anything in Schedule 1 is considered the most dangerous drug, the most potential for harm and with no recognized medical value. And then they go down in recognize less harm and increase medical value to Schedule 5, which is like aspirin. Nixon works very, very hard to convince Congress to place marijuana in Schedule 1, albeit temporarily. He says that he would place it there pending the results of an investigation, which the Controlled Substances Act also calls for, called the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, nicknamed the Schafer Commission after its leader, Raymond Schafer, Republican of my home state of Pennsylvania. So the Schafer Commission spends 2 years and roughly $13 million researching marijuana use in the United States. And Nixon is pushing very hard for them to find correlations between that drug use and the things that Nixon blames pot for, which include violence, harder drug use, or the declining moral state of the nation. But that's not what happens. Instead, members argue that they find that there's no difference between marijuana smokers and non-marijuana smokers, and that marijuana laws ultimately do more harm to society than good, because they make youth strongly distrustful of national leaders and the police and laws. They conclude by arguing very strongly for decriminalization, not legalization, but national decriminalization. Nixon is not happy with this report. But others are very inspired by it. The Schafer Commission's report was released in 1972, and you can buy like 25-cent paperback copies of the condensed final thing. It's a huge book that really inspires a lot of people and is widely available. And in 1973, after a wave of young progressive politicians are elected to the state legislature, Oregon passes the first statewide decriminalization law. They take the Schafer Commission's recommendations and turn them into a statewide experiment, basically. They allow residents to possess up to 1 ounce of pot for the equivalent of, a traffic ticket, a civil fine. And what's remarkable is that even a year after these laws go into effect, the sky doesn't fall. People don't start smoking pot in enormous numbers. Rates actually stay steady or even somewhat decline. The majority of the people in the state really support this action. Prodded by national organizations like NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, which was founded by Keith Stroup here in DC in 1970, other states start to pass decriminalization laws as well. And by 1978, a dozen states, including somewhat surprising ones like Mississippi, Minnesota, or Nebraska, have decriminalized the personal possession of pot. Even Jimmy Carter, who successfully ran for president in 1976, had as a small part of his campaign the support for state-based decriminalization. For activists, it felt like their moment had come. Many believed that national decriminalization and ultimately legalization was around the corner. As Ina Garten says, how easy was that, right? This was not, I'm so glad there's some Ina Garten fans here. Yes. This was not to occur. While decriminalization laws were spreading across the country, another industry is popping up alongside of it, something that I think could have been predicted. By 1977, the paraphernalia market was bringing in $250 million a year. In today's dollars, that's $1 billion. The 1970s did not have a very strong economic structure, but the one growth market was actually in paraphernalia, the sales of pipes, bongs, rolling papers, toys, anything to appeal to this growing marijuana culture and the growing number of people who could smoke it and use it, albeit not legally, but without the threat of incarceration. This market was able to succeed thanks to increasing interest in the drug, of course, but also because of the new panoply of magazines that are being published at this time to cater to this new industry, including things like High Times, Stone Age, Stoned, etc. They're devoted to this new culture, and they're also in need of advertising dollars. So suddenly you have a huge market producing these things, readers and advertisements all coming together. A lot of these products also seem to target children. There are bongs shaped like spaceships, the Buzzbee, a frisbee with a pipe inside of it, a You're the Dealer board game. I've seen these advertisements, these things existed. The difference between decriminalization and legalization is that decriminalization doesn't have these same levels of regulation and oversight that legalization has. So by 1979, drawn in by these magazines, Cheech and Chong movies, music, all this other stuff, 11% of high school seniors reported smoking pot every day. And children as young as 13 reported that the drug was easy to get. And of course, these are just the people reporting. So who knows what the actual numbers are. This situation, rapid, near nationwide acceptance of decriminalization, compounded by a powerful and profitable boom in paraphernalia manufacturing and the subsequent rise in adolescent marijuana use, launches the first marijuana counter-revolution, the Parent Movement, which forms in Atlanta, Georgia in 1976. Parent activists are legitimately scared of their children's marijuana use. And historians in the past have kind of made them into a caricature and made fun of them. But I chose not to because a lot of them were supporters of Jimmy Carter. A lot of them had very strong liberal Democrat backgrounds. But they had reason to be terrified that their children were starting to use this drug. Information about it at the time suggested that marijuana would make young boys grow breasts, that it would render young girls infertile. They were terrified of amotivational syndrome, something I'm sure we've all heard about, right? They were scared that their kids were going to give up on life before it had even really begun. So they started to gather together, essentially into consciousness-raising groups, to borrow a term from second-wave feminism, to discuss the problem and how to make it stop. Their movement takes off. It goes gangbusters very, very, very rapidly because of the escalating rates of adolescent drug use. By 1980, there are parent groups across the country, and rates of adolescent marijuana use in return actually plunge. But this is also the year that Ronald Reagan was elected president, and his wife, Nancy Reagan, becomes First Lady, and First Ladies need platforms. The prevention of adolescent drug use seems like a really good one for someone who, when her husband was elected, was called by the Los Angeles Times a frivolous social climber akin to Lady Macbeth. So she needs something to make her seem warmer and more maternal and more loving. And man, preventing kids from using drugs, like, it's a win-win, right? So with several parent activists' help, the First Lady transforms into the country's most famous anti-drug activist. And I have an entire chapter about how she steals the concept of just say no from an African-American grandmother in Oakland. And I don't have the time to go into it. I think it's chapter 8. Please read it. We can talk about it in the Q&A. But this is where we see the pendulum take its first really big swing, moving from tacit acceptance of decriminalization in the 70s to a fierce demonization of the drug in the 1980s. In short, the power of parent activists was that they were able to change the conversation about drug use in the United States. Decriminalization laws were passed on the idea that an adult has the right to do what they choose in the comfort of their own home, assuming they're not hurting anyone else. But parent activists and Nancy Reagan turned this conversation on its head. Drug use is no longer about an adult's right to do something of their choosing. It is about a child's right to grow up drug-free. And this shift paints all drug-using adults as dangers to drug-free children, and thus worthy of being locked up or criminalized for their marijuana use, which they are, in growing numbers. But the nation's turn against marijuana does not launch what we now understand as the war on drugs, with capital letters, right? The war on drugs in the 1980s. That starts in 1986, in the wake of national hysteria about crack cocaine, and really in the after effects of the death of Len Bias. And he overdosed on powder cocaine, so it doesn't make any sense. That's when footage of major drug busts is on the nightly news, when fears of crack babies and instant addiction, no matter how untrue, was rampant. And it was also when drug offenses lead to an overwhelming number of African-American males being incarcerated, which is something we'll talk about again in a minute. But crack, surprisingly, does more for the legalization campaign than anything else, because it makes marijuana seem tame in comparison. And it sets the stage for a national resurrection of marijuana as a medical substance. The crack crisis hits America during a unique time, because it also hits during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, just when it's beginning to emerge. In cities like San Francisco, dozens and then hundreds of young men and some women, most of whom were gay, are succumbing to this strange new disease. An activist named Brownie Mary Rathbun, Mary Jane, that was actually her real name, it's very prescient, so named for the brownie she baked containing a special ingredient. She's working with these young men. She lives in the Castro district, and she cares very much about them. And she's watching them fall apart from wasting syndrome, from Kaposi's sarcoma, from series of the nausea of the after effects of chemotherapy and things like that. And she wants to help them. The rest of America is essentially ignoring this problem. She finds that if she bakes some pot into some brownies and gives it to these young men, it helps them. It relieves their nausea, it gives them a little bit of energy, it gives them an appetite. Others pick up on this too, and they start using pot to treat a lot of things: glaucoma, cancer again, IBS, other issues. And suddenly marijuana isn't a national scourge destroying a generation of young people. It's a medicine, and one that can provide relief for a condition that very few can understand. Brownie Mary and Dennis Perron, a marijuana and gay rights activist also in San Francisco, together they pushed for the passage of Proposition 215 in 1996, which allows doctors in California to recommend, not prescribe, but recommend the use of marijuana for patients suffering from any illness. By 1997, the New York Times reports that nearly a third of Americans know someone who uses marijuana for medical reasons. So it's quite remarkable that in about a decade, marijuana transforms from a national scourge to a potential panacea. And the drug war begins to shape in turn. Suddenly, people are less concerned about the victims of drug use and more for the victims of the drug war itself. And we can see this in medical marijuana's fairly rapid spread and increasingly widespread support. 29 states and DC now allow doctors to recommend it. This is not to say, of course, that people magically stop being locked up for pot after the first medical marijuana laws are passed. Instead, marijuana arrests rise quite rapidly. Pot accounted for about 30% of drug arrests in 1990, but by 2002, it accounted for over 50% of drug arrests. And in 2007, when marijuana arrests peaked in the US, over 872,000 people were arrested that year for pot. That's a bust nearly every 37 seconds. And the majority of these people were African American, who are nearly 4 times, and sometimes in some states up to 8 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana than whites, even though people use the drug at basically the same rate. Michelle Alexander was a lawyer working for the ACLU in California. She notices this trend. And her 2010 book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, details the immense negative effects of incarcerating a wider percentage of Black Americans than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. And her book is banned from from jails in 2 states, I think in New Jersey and California, because God forbid people arrested read what's happening to them. She demanded action on the part of anyone interested in social justice to stop the mass jailing of nonviolent inmates, which she also saw as a renewed form of segregation. She never outright suggests that legalization is the answer. Instead, that's the work of a new generation of activists who were inspired by pot's 20-year history as a medicine, and who see legalization as a chance to both reduce the number of Black arrests and basically equalize the playing field for Blacks and whites. In fact, social justice has become the most powerful argument for legalization yet. It's passed recreational laws in 8 states and Washington, D.C. since 2012. The tax windfall is great, but it's always secondary in importance. Gavin Newsom, the Assistant Attorney General of California, who will most likely be running for governor, right? He always talks about social justice. That's the key. Even the new governor of New Jersey, who may be the first person to pass legalization by state legislature and not ballot initiative, which is big, he's going for the taxes, but he says it's for social justice, and that's the big thing. When politicians and supporters discuss legalization, their number one justification is always social justice. So, does it work? And the answer is yes and no. Marijuana arrests as a whole are down, but Blacks are still more likely to get arrested for marijuana even in legalized states. And few states have also included additional legislation that would expunge someone's prior record after legalization is passed. So marijuana crimes can still continue to haunt people well into the future. And of course, if legalization activists pin their hopes on actually making America live up to its creed, they're in for some real disappointment, right? Pot is not what makes America racist, nor is legalization going to disrupt 400 years of systemic racism. So that's a bummer. So where does this leave us? Legalization is popular and spreading. But as I said before, a new anti-marijuana counter-revolution is also forming. Jeff Sessions is renewing the federal threat against pot, while Big Pharma launches a multi-million-dollar lobbying campaign against it. And if 60% of Americans support legalization, that does still leave 40% who are either against it or just don't care. Keep in mind that only about 10% of Americans report having smoked pot in the past year, and 5% have reported smoking in the past month. Legalization is an exciting issue, but it doesn't quite have that same, personal cachet as topics like gay marriage or universal health care. We are, after all, still talking about an intoxicating drug. So what happens next? Unfortunately, I am a historian and not an oracle. I would get paid more if I were an oracle. So I can't say for sure, but I do know that I wasn't surprised by Sessions revoking the Cole memo, or that legalization is birthing a new counter-revolution of its own. And that's because of this, and this is by far the most important point I can make tonight. Marijuana is the only drug in America that has the distinct ability to move back and forth between legality and illegality. And pot lives in these various iterations because we put it there, using things like grassroots activism, ballot initiatives, influencing state representatives, presidents, or first ladies. Whether they were anti-war activists in the 1960s, worried parents in the 1970s or 80s, or social justice activists today, people see in marijuana a threat or a promise, but always something bigger and more important, more worthy of legislation than themselves. Because of that, I think that the declarations of the permanence of marijuana's current legal status are always premature. Because after researching the subject for 7 years, I have come to the distinct conclusion that pot is a lot like that old saying about the weather. Whenever you think that the law on marijuana is final, just wait 5 minutes or 5 years. It will change. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes.
You guys, please line up and your microphones if you have your questions.
It's a race to the microphone.
Thank you. It's a very provocative topic, and I'm wondering two separate questions. One is in the late 60s, 70s, when I was living in Boulder, there was a lot of talk about marijuana as the gateway drug. Mm-hmm. And was there a similar sort of cultural fear about these other drugs at the time, LSD or other things, and that marijuana was somehow the easier one to attack or to move back and forth? I liked how you were relating it to crack cocaine, but I'm wondering if there's an earlier precedent for the fight really being about fear of a different drug.
Yeah.
And then also, I'm wondering if in the book you talk about the dealer side, the sort of distribution, the drug industry of illegal drugs. How much is that a conversation? It certainly is about other illegal drugs, and we're afraid of how they're distributed or how they're brought into the country. Is that part of the distraction about marijuana, or is it actually part of the reasoning behind some of these pendulum swings? Thank you.
Oh, great questions. Boulder in the 60s. That must have been awesome. That's a really interesting question, too, because crack was not the only drug that kind of influenced marijuana's reputation in the United States. Between about 1967 and 1976, it's easy to remember because you just switched the last two digits, America actually experienced a fairly pronounced heroin epidemic at that time as well. You might think about 1971's Panic in Needle Park, sort of a representation of that. And because America was experiencing this is also when methadone clinics first start to open and things like that. Again, marijuana always seems like a safer drug when we are experiencing abuse of something else. The exact same thing is happening today with the opioid epidemic. So fears of heroin, I think, also helped with the rising acceptance of decriminalization of marijuana. The gateway drug theory will never die because it is true for some people and it is not true for other people. It is feared that, you start experimenting with substances and it rises and rises and rises. Most recently, I think Sessions was talking about that again as well. But for the most part, marijuana exists in a sort of back and forth relationship with other drugs in the United States. What makes Sessions' actions so unique is because it goes against the historical grain. Even though over 50,000 people died of opioid overdoses last year, he's re-attacking marijuana and basically ignoring that crisis, which is probably a bad idea. As far as the drug industry is concerned, I did not focus too much about that historically, but I've been writing a lot about what the legal marijuana industry looks like right now. And that is actually one of the things that I think worries most legalization activists, because they're so intensely afraid of the rise of big marijuana, particularly in California, where not all areas of the state, but some do not place limits on the size of farms. So some of the smaller growers in places like the Emerald Triangle are already getting pushed out of business because there are huge farms being built, people who can afford the $125,000 annual fee. So the fact that some very large growers may come in and flood the market is worrisome to the people who want to believe that marijuana will continue to have that very strong, like, mom and pop, down-home hippie feel. If that answers your question. Cool. Yeah.
Hi, Emily. I'm Alex Langer. I actually work with the Marijuana Policy Project, which is, as I'm sure you know, one of the leading organizations fighting against prohibition and the injustices that come along with the war on drugs as a whole. So you were very prescient with Jeff Sessions and predicting him rescinding the Cole memo. And I know you said you're a historian and you don't want to make predictions, but of course we're seeing this action by the Attorney General galvanize our core support more than really anything we've seen for the past few years, even the 2016 elections where there were a lot of states voting for legalization. So what a lot of my colleagues are saying is that the Attorney General's action is going to cause a lot of backlash on the federal level, obviously on the state level as well. It's going to galvanize people, but that Congress is actually going to get so much uproar from their constituents and others that they're actually going to take action to solidify the Rohrabacher Amendment, if not go further to protect recreational marijuana on the state level, and or even deschedule marijuana. There's kind of a range of spectrum of things they could do. But how do you kind of see this playing out within the next year or two? Do you see there being a major swing? And I'd just love your opinion on that.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been reading a lot about that too, and it is interesting because this has really galvanized people in no other way. And it's crazy because if the budget really does expire tomorrow, then the Rohrabacher now it's the Blumenauer. It used to be Rohrabacher Feingold, and now it's Rohrabacher Blumen. That's a congressional amendment that basically protects medical laws in states, and that could expire. But I have heard that there is increased interest in having a similar congressional amendment for recreational legalization laws, which would provide more standing for them. As far as rescheduling or descheduling is concerned, I don't know. It would be so hard, right?
I mean, we see that as the most extreme kind of
that would be
possibility.
Nuts. And it would take years and years and years because, basically Congress would have to, get the ball rolling. The DEA, the FDA, HHS would all have to, test marijuana to ensure that it actually does have medical value, which hasn't been done to this point. It would take years and years and years to actually go through the whole federal process to either reschedule it or deschedule it completely, which would be incredibly difficult. The most important thing I would see would be a congressional amendment similar to Rohrabacher to protect those laws, and that would block DOJ funds from attacking them specifically. That would be like the best case scenario. But, I could be wrong.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Oh, I think he was first.
Oh, okay. Here we go. I'm just coming back.
Sure. My question is, I have two questions. One is, in researching your book, or maybe it's in the book, how do our bordering countries influence America's stance on pot? And Canada is going to legalize it, I guess, in July of this year. Yeah. So how would that, maybe how does that play out? And then also, pot's cousin, hemp. How does that factor in your book? When did it? I mean, I don't know. When did it become illegal? I know now. I think it's commercially grown in a few states, but under very strict laws and regulations. So maybe just talk about that.
The neighbors thing is interesting, right? So Canada might legalize, or it will legalize. It'll go into action in July, but it's always had somewhat loose relationship with it, right? Like Vancouver has always had basically decriminalization and availability. But once it is fully legalized, I mean, that really makes the West Coast just this enormous block of legalization. It is like, wow, it's a different country over there. My sister's here. She lives in Seattle. She knows. So I don't know. But one of the larger driving supporters for legalization is that people say that if we grow it ourselves and it's legal, it supports farmers and there's taxation, it's taking away money from Mexican drug cartels, which is a very, very convincing argument, particularly for voters in Southern California, where you heard that the most. So that's a driving factor. I think with Canada's influence in the north and trying to prevent the rise of gang violence and things like that in the south, considering the fact that we don't live in a vacuum and the United States does have neighbors and we do exist in a global context, is people have been using that as supportive arguments for legalization rather than detractions from it. For hemp, I actually don't know too much about it. I know that hemp, like the campaign to legalize hemp was really, really big in the 90s. The Emperor Wears No Clothes, Jack Herer's book, and things like that. That's sort of like the most closely associated knowledge I have about it. Of course, in 1942, I think the United States released a film called Hemp for Victory, because our hemp supplies that were coming from the South Pacific were squarely in the hands of the Japanese. So the United States encouraged farmers to grow like 50,000 acres of it to support the war effort. So that was the only time pot was ever patriotic. But of course, hemp is a very different thing. And there are a lot of people within the legalization movement who are like, hemp can save the world, cars can run on hemp oil, it's going to be amazing. And it's well, maybe tone it down. But I could get back to you more with hemp information. Maybe I'll be the next book.
Hi, I'm Perry Frank, and I came in late, so you may have covered this, but the parallel between this era's issue and prohibition. There certainly are many parallels here. The long fight for prohibition, going back well into the 19th century, and then, well, we all know the history of that. Now, I want to point out that even though we've stopped incarcerating people, we haven't stopped hospitalizing people for issues with alcohol, and it is a huge problem. Excuse me, thank you very much. And the thing about marijuana is, well, first of all, I want to point out that the push for legalization did not start 10 years ago or whatever. Right. It was going on big time, at least 30 years ago, because there was a big demonstration on the mall every year, and I happen to know about that closely because of someone closely associated with me who led it. Oh, and incident, I shouldn't say this, but is now living in my home. Well, you get the picture. And so this has been a long-fought thing, and we're still going back and forth about the effects, and it's nothing to joke about. I wonder how much how much is coming out about, and I know because it's the same with alcohol, that a few people get into trouble and many do not. So I wonder if you have comments on that, that whole, and the incarceration issue. It's much broader than about drugs. The incarceration of African Americans and so forth, it goes much, it's universal for everything. We need to address the whole thing.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, so the prohibition thing is great, right? It's really the only parallel you can draw, right, between marijuana and alcohol, and prohibition. Prohibition being like really the only other substances move back and forth between legality and illegality. But prohibition, of course, is also unique because it was both criminalized and decriminalized, or re-legalized, I should say, by constitutional amendment, which kind of ends the discussion, right? You don't really, and it's so great because it's the 18th and 21st Amendment, and those are the two legal ages at which you can drink, so it's so easy to remember. I love that. I always remember that. But it's, and like, I mean, the other thing from the guy from MPP, right? Like, well, yeah, maybe we could have a constitutional amendment. That'd be great. But like, probably not, right? But it's also interesting because the people working for prohibition came from a similar sort of situation or mindset as the people who are opposing decriminalization. There's a threat to the family, it's a threat to children. It was a threat to the structure, the normative structure of the United States nuclear family. So those are very powerful arguments, and I don't see them disappearing anytime soon either. As far as alcohol is concerned, I mean, it's really interesting because, of course, in January, major news outlets always run a lot of stories about alcohol and alcohol abuse because of the debauchery of the holiday season. And so there's a lot of, people doing dry Januaries and things like that, and you hear about the negative effects of alcohol, which is an incredibly problematic drug. And I heard somewhere that, like, if we're trying to legalize alcohol today, it would be a Schedule I drug because it is so intensely toxic. But I don't know too much about rates of, certainly in Colorado after legalization went into effect, there was a lot of hospitalization of children who were mistakenly eating edibles. That was probably one of the largest stories about the really intensive medical dangers of marijuana. And in subsequent years, other states have actually tried to remedy that problem. California has very strict laws for the edibles available now that it's legalized. You can't use the word candy. It can't have cartoons on it. It can't look like something that would be really appealing to kids because they're trying to counteract the problems from Colorado. And this is, 4 years later, they're sort of, correcting their mistakes, which is really a rapid transformation. And incarceration is, yeah, we should probably do something about that, right? It's bad. I don't know what else to say about it. I think Michelle Alexander said it a lot better than I can. So please buy her book too. Yes.
I know you said you weren't dealing with it right now, but could you give us capsule, the summary view of before 1960s about the way the back and forth went? Or did it go back and forth?
Mostly just went back. So marijuana has been, or cannabis as a whole, has been known for its pain-relieving and antiemetic properties for thousands of years. It was used in the Zhou dynasty in China. Queen Victoria used it to relieve her cramps. Many things. In the 19th century, about like 1860s or so, it was widely available in corner pharmacies in tinctures. Mothers would use it on teething babies' gums. You could purchase it most anywhere. Things started to change with the rise of progressivism in the turn of the 20th century. So by the time the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act was passed and there were rules for labeling, you could no longer really sell cannabis tinctures as such in corner pharmacies. Marijuana as a recreational drug also was taking off in the early 20th century as Mexicans were fleeing the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz and coming across the border, and they were familiar with using pot as a recreational substance. They were bringing it along with them. So naturally, it becomes deeply racialized. There's a 1917 Treasury Department report that declared that marijuana was only being used by Mexicans, blacks, and lower class whites. So of course that's very bad, right? And it's a danger to families and white women and blah, blah, blah. So the first federal law against the drug is in 1934, the Marijuana Tax Act, which does not criminalize marijuana, but suggests that if you're going to grow it or transport it, you have to pay a tax to the federal government. But nonetheless, actually, states have the ability to create their own drug laws, marijuana laws. Texas, you get thrown in the slammer forever. Other states are a little bit more loose. It's not until the 1970 Controlled Substances Act that a federal law against marijuana actually cohesively comes together. So that is your 30-second pre-1964 history of pot. Yes.
Well, I survived the 60s. It must have warped me because I became a lawyer. But at any rate, about the effects, I know you've been talking about it. But what does science conclude? I mean, is it anything so negative? I know different people react differently, but it seems to me to be benign, minor effects that shouldn't put people in jail, obviously. I mean, does it have negative effects? It has medicinal effects. Outside of getting you a little high, I mean, it seems a lot more benign than alcohol.
Right. There are no recorded deaths from marijuana. There are recorded deaths from marijuana along with other substances, but there are no recorded deaths strictly from marijuana. The problem is that because marijuana remains a Schedule I substance and because doing any sort of scientific experiment or study with it is so incredibly difficult because it's so difficult to get enough of the drug to actually use in a study, to have a control group. Like, do you want pregnant women smoking pot to see if it actually affects the baby? Like, they're the control group and then the others don't, or what? Like, we don't know.
There's a lot of drugs that are much worse that are legal. I mean, how did
Absolutely.
marijuana get picked out?
Oh, because of Nixon.
No, but before Nixon, there was reefer madness. There was all that.
Oh, because of Harry Anslinger. Oh, we can go back. There's a line of men who just really hate pot. Actually, it's rather fascinating.
Not the men, yeah.
But why? I mean, that's the thing, right? The biggest question, and that kind of goes to the heart of it. Like, why this drug of all the drugs? And I think it's because so many people, they put a lot of weight onto it because it's been racialized, because it's been doing all these other things. But I think it's because a lot of people also use it and it becomes very scary, right? Like, people believe that it is the panacea for all things and that there's absolutely no harm associated with whatsoever, which is not necessarily true. Other people seem to believe that if you use it, you immediately go to heroin addiction and you run over your neighbor's dog and you're high on the highway and you kill everyone. It's just... If I knew the exact answer to that, I probably would have written a better book. But but it's hard to say. Like, why pot? And it's because people have been fighting over it for, at this point, 50 and if not longer, more years.
Just a quick anecdote. Michael Kinsley, the pundit, when the first Judge Ginsburg got nominated, and if you remember, he was doing dope with his students. He was a Harvard law professor.
Yep.
Kinsley wrote a column. He said, when I was in college, I tried marijuana and deeply regretted it.
Yep.
I then tried it the next day and deeply regretted it. I then did it every day for the next 3 years, each time deeply regretting
it. That's great. Hi, Drew.
Hello. Well, I hate to hear you say things like you wish you wrote a better book, because I think you wrote an excellent book.
Thank you. This is my friend Drew, not just someone. Thank you.
Sure. I was wondering, have you come across any information related to private prisons and lobbyists, therefore, and prison guard unions lobbying for maintaining criminalization?
Yes, actually, and they aren't giving as much money as pharmaceutical manufacturers, but a lot of, like, Geo is one of the leading private prison industries. They're spending a lot of money, and one of the reasons why Jeff Sessions may have revoked the Cole memo is because he is also a large supporter of private prisons, and the more people you arrest who go to private prisons, the more money that they make. Again, federal arrests are like not the major. They're not the major source for marijuana crimes. To get a minimum 5-year mandatory minimum sentence, you have to have over 200 pounds of the drug on you. And to get a minimum tenure, you have to have over 2,000 pounds of the drug on you. So it's like, you know, these small scale people who have like a little bit of pot who are going to jail. I mean, those are state jails. Those are, and they're for the most part offending state laws. To actually get a federal system or a federal sentence, you have to be a major trafficker. But there is some fear that the private prison industry is very much so behind anti-legalization efforts as well. Yeah. Yeah. Super. Yeah.
What role does the liquor industry lobbyists play in relation to the legalization efforts?
Specifically, the liquor industry lobbyists, I don't know, but I would say that the liquor industry is actually incredibly excited about legalization. They're trying to partner with cannabis, like legalized cannabis companies. Constellation Brands, which owns Svedka and Modelo and Corona. So what's that other beer? They just bought a minority stake in a Canadian medical cannabis company because they want to create a cannabis-infused beer. Yeah, I know. I was like, ugh. But for real, I mean, states that have legalized, Washington, Colorado, Vermont potentially, have also a huge craft brew industry. And I talked to the guy who is in charge of the Craft Brewers Association of America. He's a really nice guy, and he has no fear whatsoever from the legalized industry. He does not fear that cannabis is going to take away people from drinking. He feels like we can have a very simpatico relationship. We can put pot in beer. We can put beer in pot. Everything's going to be great. But that's really interesting, right? Because certain wine growers are really opposed to legal cannabis because they hate having their farms next to other ones. The cannabis farms are very resource intensive. They take a ton of water. They smell. They're illegal for the most part, at least federally so. If a marijuana crop burns, you can't get insurance. Because it remains a Schedule I drug, so you lose all of your money. It's a very dangerous thing to have next door. So some other intoxicant industries, I guess for lack of a better term, are very excited about actually partnering with cannabis, where others, including pharmaceutical manufacturers and things like that, are very, very hesitant to actually embrace the new field. Good question. Yeah. Hey, Jordan.
Could you tell us a little bit more about New Jersey and the significance of having a legislative legalization effort versus the referendums that you've seen, California and Oregon, elsewhere?
It's huge.
Okay.
It's huge. If New Jersey passes by legislature, it will be the first time that is done. All other legalization laws have passed through ballot initiative. And ballot initiatives are an incredible way to pass laws, but they're only available in about 50% of the states. New Jersey, New York doesn't have that available. So you can't just go out and gather the signatures to get something there. You have to actually go through state legislatures. The majority of governors in America currently are Republican. Generally, legislatures move more slowly. Generally, they're more hesitant to embrace some of these more alternative ideas, I guess we could call them. But if New Jersey does, it will be the first to do so, and it will be a rather remarkable shift. And it will kind of open the door for more support potentially within state legislatures themselves. Although there are still problems, right? Maine passed legalization in 2016 via ballot initiative, but the governor refuses to sign it. So LePage is basically holding it up. Vermont and New Hampshire are trying to do it through the state legislature, but it's very difficult. There's no way a golden path to anything forward. It remains incredibly difficult regardless of which path you choose.
Thank you all so much for coming out tonight.
Thank you, everyone.